To solve question number 1, letter A, we're going to need to think about some strategies. This one definitely doesn't look like I can move things around very easily because I have an x squared and a 10x, which is going to make things kind of difficult. To make this problem easier, the best strategy would be to begin with moving this negative 3 over to the left-hand side of the equation. If I do that, I'd have x squared plus 10x, now plus 3, equals 0. When we look at the problem now, we can try to factor it, but unfortunately, if we set up a diamond problem, we would need numbers that multiply to 3 and add to 10, and no nice numbers exist that would work that way. When factoring doesn't work, the best fallback strategy is to use the formula that we call the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula always works when factoring doesn't. If you have forgotten the quadratic formula, the formula goes like this. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Those numbers for a, b, and c that we plug in come from the equation. The first term, the second term, and the third term in the equation are going to give us those values of a, b, and c. The number next to x squared is what we consider the a. Since you don't see a number x squared or next to x squared, we can imply that that's 1. The number next to x gives us the b value, so in this case b is 10. And the constant term is always what gives us the c value, which means c is 3. To plug in those numbers into the formula, I'll start by plugging in negative b, so that'd be negative 10, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that'd be 10 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 3, all over 2 times a, which is 1. When you plug everything in, then it's just a matter of simplifying. PEMDAS is a good rule to follow in order to make sure you're simplifying the correct order of operations. We'll start inside the square root, so we keep the negative 10 plus or minus. Then inside the square root we have 10 squared, which is 100, minus 4 times 1 times 3, which is 12, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. If we continue simplifying a little bit further, that'll give us negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 100 minus 12, which is 88, all over 2. Now at this point, you could theoretically stop here because the square root of 88 is not really a nice number. 88 is not a perfect square. However, we do often continue simplifying because usually we try to simplify any square root or any fraction as far as we can. If you've forgotten how to square root or simplify a square root, here's the easiest rule of thumb that we stick with. We're going to try to break down the square root of 88 into a product of two numbers. There are several ways we could break down an 88. We could make it into an 11 times 8. We could make it into 4 times 22. We could make it into 88 times 1. But of all the different ways we can break it down, we want to try to break it down so that one of the factors is a perfect square. I'm going to use the 4 and the 22 because 4 is a perfect square, and that's going to work nicely in my simplification. To do that, we're going to rewrite the square root instead of 88 as the square root of 4 times 22. Makes sense? It's equivalent. We're allowed to do that. Technically, the square root of 4 times 22 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 22, separated. And we know, of course, that the square root of 4 is indeed 2. If we leave the square root of 22, since it itself is not a perfect square, then that means we have successfully completely factored down our square root. We usually do want to look inside just to see if we can break down the inside number any further, but since 22 is really 2 times 11 or 22 times 1, neither of those is a perfect square, so there's nothing else we can do. We're left with 2 square root 22 as simplified as we can be. Now going back to our original problem then, that means instead of square root 88 inside, we have 2 root 22 instead, over 2. And the reason we do that is so we can try to simplify as much of the problem as we can. We can't simplify numbers inside square roots, but we can simplify any numbers that are outside the square root, which would include the negative 10, the 2, and the 2. All of those numbers are divisible by 2, so if I divide all of those numbers, I would get negative 5 plus or minus 2 divided by 2 would just be 1 square root 22 over 2, which is really going to divide, give me 1, and we don't really need to write over 1. So the most graceful way of writing our answer is -5 plus or minus the square root of 22. You'll notice that we have one large answer space here, which is usually the problem's way of implying that this is going to be one answer with a plus or minus sign. Technically, it's two separate answers, but you only have to write it once.